And I'd like to first acknowledge that this work is conducted with Dr. Kristen Summer, but obviously I'm doing the presentation today. Okay, so I'm shifting gears a little bit because I'm not directly talking about education here, but for those of you who aren't aware, we know about 2 to 3% of children are autistic. So that's about 1 in each classroom. So this is relevant for everyone, but I am speaking more from a psychologist perspective here. So for those who aren't aware, and this project I'm talking about is not published either yet, but I don't mind it being recorded. Everything's open access and on OSF anyway, so you can track this down. And so for those who aren't aware, that mental health is a significant issue for autistic people. And in fact, we know that across the lifespan, that autistic people are at elevated risk for mental health conditions, with up to 79% of individuals meeting criteria for one or more mental health conditions. And of course, mental health is essential for our overall well-being, our quality of life. And sadly, we know that poor mental health contributes to premature mortality in this population, with the average life expectancy of autistic people much lower than non-autistic counterparts. So we know then that mental health is a significant issue for this population. Somewhat ironically, Will Mandy puts it far better than I do, that the autism mental health crisis can really be described, though, with the paradox that while autistic people have a much higher chance of developing mental health problems, they have a really low chance of receiving effective help. And there's a number of reasons why this may be. And some of those reasons are that our mental health services and supports are predominantly based around neurotypical norms. So for example, around the way that mental health needs may be expressed and how one accesses mental health supports, and around how one acts in therapy, for example. There's also impacts around clinicians. So in some of my own work with my students, we've found that psychologists feel less confident working with autistic than non-autistic clients, and they report not having the knowledge and skills. And what happens there, though, is that people are bounced around by people saying, oh, I don't know how to work with autistic people, and then they miss out on effective supports. We also have some systemic factors that many of you will be aware of in terms of barriers to healthcare and mental health care, where, for example, services are often segregated into, say, child and adult services, with many more child services available, into mental health services versus neurodevelopmental services, where if you have both, where do you go? And there are huge wait lists at present, and a lack of funding and supports, and significant gap fees as well for mental health support. And we also see an intersection between autism characteristics and mental health that can impact the ability to seek therapy and to engage in therapy when you've got predominantly neurotypical therapists who might not recognise the communication differences. We also see what's called alexithymia, which is difficulties with verbalizing and identifying your emotions, which can impact on your engagement in therapy. And sensory processing can be an impact and a barrier of things like even as simple as our extremely noisy construction field clinics at the moment at Gold Coast campus. Oops, I skipped a page. And so really inspired by these issues, started looking into this with Christian, who is my autistic collaborator, and kind of around a table went, geez, what's your therapy been like? And I think the answer, well, maybe some expletives there, got us putting together and go, well, surely there's some guidelines out there for how to adapt therapy for those who are fortunate to get to the point of seeing a therapist. Like, what can psychologists or other therapists do to make sure therapy is as effective as possible? What was really interesting, though, is that we actually couldn't find any of that. So there weren't any lists or guidelines written by autistic people. There's only 1 or 2 papers out there that might have suggested, say, 5 or 7 adaptations for therapy from autistic people. And really, most of the research is actually clinicians saying, hey, I think this would be a way to adapt therapy. And quite often it was about a specific therapy, like how we adapted a eating disorder treatment for autism, rather than general guidelines for good practice, which in reality, as a clinician, you actually see a range of presentations and use a range of therapies. And so we drew together the research from clinician adaptations. It gave us a list of about 50 practices. But we also drew from the lived experience research that there were metasyntheses of autistic people's experiences in mental health care, which also inspired some additional adaptations we added to our list. And we also consulted with our autistic research assistants and our colleagues, and drew from clinical experience too, of which the things we might kind of do as a common sense way to make therapy more effective for this population. And of course, we've refined and pilot tested this with autistic adults. I think speaking to the interest in this area, usually recruitment is something we really struggle with. We got over 100 participants in 6 days. So this tells you that the community thought this research was something that's really needed to get such a strong response so quickly. And so we had a list of 55, and I'll break down into what categories, but I'm conscious of the short time. But the biggest ones that came up from our list that were rated on average the highest were psychologists having a high level about knowledge about autism, providing options to book online, using a neurodiversity affirming approach, providing therapy in individual sessions rather than groups, which was actually something we were a little surprised by, and using questionnaires or measures designed by or with autistic people, which also highlights the fact there's a gap that more of these need to actually be developed as well. We then categorized our 55 items into 8 subscales that we did kind of logically. We did play with the factor analysis, but we ended up needing to just use Cronbach's alpha because it didn't stick quite as well as we were hoping, and dropped a few items out. And then we've categorized then those practices into these 8 categories, and green were the highest rating, where on average they were rated as helpful or very helpful on a Likert scale. Orange were kind of mixed results, so where they might have been rated as sort of a 3 or a 4, and red was where it was kind of rated unhelpful on average. And I'm going to unpack those on the next slides. But when we say neurodiversity affirming, this was really the most popular set of strategies. And this particularly included saying the psychologist uses a neurodiversity affirming approach, accepting a diagnosis without further questioning it or querying someone, and using therapies or supports developed by or with autistic people. And what was really interesting to me when I think about we've had recent changes to our code of ethics was psychologists disclosing themselves that they identify as autistic was quite popular. But that's actually against our current code of ethics. It's just come out saying that you shouldn't self-disclose. So that's going to lead to a little bit of advocacy, I think. In terms of information and advanced preparation, I'm not going to read all of these verbatim because of the time. I will say everything's on OSF if you want to look at some more details. But really, this was around letting people know in advance what to expect, what supports outside of the session, and providing visual and written information. Next was sensory processing differences. So considering in the environment of the clinic that there's an appropriate or manageable sensory environment, including giving the options to adjust, say, the lighting in the room, and providing sensory or fidget items for use in sessions was also something people rated as being quite helpful. Where we got mixed was around saying, would you like differences in our traditional therapy modality? So booking online and providing therapy in individual sessions were items that were rated as quite helpful. Whereas interestingly, many of our participants said they didn't want to do groups with other autistic people, and they didn't want to do therapy on the telephone, and kind of mixed results about video conferencing. In terms of therapist communication, the 2 ones that were rated most helpful was explaining terminology in measures or questionnaires, and the explicit consent to not have to endorse neurotypical norms such as eye contact. So saying you don't actually have to make eye contact. And we did have some open-ended responses to that elaborated on some of these items. Visual support, so using visuals in therapy was rated quite highly, whereas there's a little bit more mixed around using structured approaches and specific sets of visuals. Techniques and approaches, so spending more time to get to know the person before working on goals was rated quite highly, whereas specific techniques like learning how to identify and express emotions, thoughts, goals, and values were a little bit more mixed. But I think this needs to be put in the perspective that this was an online survey and that we were targeting participants then who had literacy skills, could read and write, which may not capture the full population of autistic people who may have some mixed levels of abilities in these areas. In terms of pace, interestingly, people said, yep, the typical psych session of 50 to 60 minutes sounded all right. The rest were rated a bit lower. And we also said, what were some additional accommodations that our participants might like, and things like offering therapy side by side, balancing strengths and weaknesses, allowing to walk around the room, so really more flexibility in the environment and the way therapy is going. And the last couple were around, explaining why, giving the rationale for your questioning, and also things like you're teaching a technique like a suicide plan. When do you actually use it? So again, being more explicit in our therapy. And these are things that we could do to make therapy better. And so what we actually did was that our list of 55 items, we actually popped together into a therapy accommodations tool with the idea that this could support people and also therapists to ask their clients about what adaptations would be useful at an individual level, because we acknowledge that within all of these items, none of these means speak for each individual, that we did have ratings between 1 and 5 for almost every item. And so what we feel would be an important step is considering and consulting with clients about what adaptations would be useful for them. And in doing so, we put this list as this was part of the feedback of results to our participants, and we've had quite positive responses to that. And we've also made it available to therapists and practitioners at the APS Neurodiversity Forum and also on our OSF page, which if you scan that picture, it'll take you to our OSF page. And we've had quite a lot, like hundreds of downloads so far, and getting some really positive just anecdotal feedback. But our next stage is really looking at applying for some funding so we can train up therapists so that they can be more neurodiversity affirming and more understanding the needs of this population. And so that's kind of the next thing, is applying for some bigger funding. And we've got an internal grant doing some qualitative exploration with autistic individuals to expand on this research, which was actually unfunded, but we were just passionate about the idea. And then now we've got a bit of funding to continue it. So I might stop sharing there, and apologies, I'll talk a mile a minute. Me talking in 10 or 15 minutes is a big request. I think I did it. So yeah, happy to have any questions. So we'll share any further stuff.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jess. This is such important work with like clear, tangible outcomes to practitioners. And I agree with Kim Fry. She also said this list of advice could certainly apply to teachers also for supporting children with autism in their classroom. Absolutely. Leonie says really powerful. I absolutely agree as well.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing that. Any questions from the audience? I found it really interesting, Jess, that the sample that you got was online, right? So we assume a level of digital literacy, yet there was this mixed findings on desire to online therapy.
No, we've had enough. We actually want face-to-face and in person and individual, which is really interesting because the guidelines written from practitioners were like, get autistic people together. They'll want to do groups with other autistic people. And actually, overwhelmingly, our participants were like, nah. But again, it highlights that we need to ask.
Absolutely,
and thanks, Sue. That's great to hear. And really our focus is on impact here, that we want to make a difference in the real world. And so we have this whole project we've set up with an open science approach. And so all our participants have given consent for sharing data that we will do for secondary analysis, for example. All our materials are on our OSF page. Our intention is to have open data, preprint, so that we can disseminate this broadly. And for those who know me will know I'm very passionate about open science, and I'm aspiring to work in this way where we're including the communities that we're impacting across every stage, and transparency across every stage as well.
Absolutely. On board with that as well. And just saying to Leonie, looking at Leonie there, I think maybe a future session focused on open science practices would be really interesting as well, Leonie. Just putting it out there.
And I can see in the chat, Sam has suggested, probing the data to see if there's different groupings at either end of the spectrum across the domains. We have actually done that. So in the paper it's on I thought if I give this talk, that'll be a good one to get me thinking of my discussion section. I've just got to write the discussion, but we've analysed it and looked at how the results might be the same or different around AQ scores, which is the autism quotient, which is a measure of the number of autism traits. And actually there wasn't a big difference, but then acknowledging that we've got a more narrow group because of the nature of our sampling, and we might get quite different responses if, for example, we met people in person, had some more supported ways to give feedback, which would be open to a broader range of the spectrum then, which we'd love to do in the future, but that we need some funding for. So
yes, hopefully you get the funding and then you'll be able to answer that question as well. Looking forward to that too, Jess. Thank you so much for such again, yet another inspiring and engaging presentation. Just looking, any final questions before we wrap up? We have 5 minutes. Some hearts being shared, and Leonie has the question.
Yeah, I can't let like 5 minutes go to waste.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to say, Rita, to go back to what you said at the beginning, and then also what Peter and Tu and Natalie were saying about the like the thread that runs across all of the work that you're all doing is that like education might look different and it might take place in different places, but it has real life and death consequences for people. And taking the time to collect the relevant data to change the way we talk with diverse people, it's life-saving. sort of work that you're doing, like that, just that one little quote that's just in the middle of a whole bunch of things where someone's saying, hey, when do I know when to use my suicide plan? It's like, oh, wow. like we know that, but the careful way in which you have presented that, I think, is just another reminder that like we are all engaged on an educational journey that isn't just a hypothetical or theoretical one. This is like a real world high stakes work. So thank you for doing it, and really, really excited that GIR is able to benefit from this work, and we will support it, of course, as often, as much as we can, anywhere. And I guess that's my little promotional reminder to people, is like part of these lightning talks is that we get to know more about each other's research, skill sets, interests, abilities, concerns, and that we network it, that we build on those networks, either directly by connecting with people or by connecting them to other people as well. So I'm always really grateful when people share, and yeah, that was terrific. I'll stop now, Sakina.
I love that share, Leonie, and that observation of the common thread across. I think one more that I observed across all of the sessions today as well is that the illusion of panacea of access, right? Sometimes we talk about just access and as if that's magical. You know, the more we get people to attend therapy, to attend university, to access social supports, means that everything will be sorted. And of course, these issues are really complex, right? So as Leonie says, yeah, it has life and death outcomes for those as well. I've been reading on this special issue of, I can't remember, it's a journal of psychiatry, something in the US, about an entire issue focused on health outcomes based on racism in life, right? And as Peter was saying as well, like, okay, you talk about financial stuff, so on and so forth. But the reality is that no matter which slice of their life you're looking at, whether at university or attending therapy and stuff like that, all of these sociopolitical occurrences are happening throughout their life and impacting on them as well. And so I am so in awe of all every single bit that all these researchers are doing in really deepening our understanding of these complexity towards bettering life outcomes of all people. So really, really wonderful there. Any final comments? Anyone wants to share reflections before we close in 3 minutes? And, probably some people rushing off to other meetings, or perhaps to get some lunch and nourish the bodies as well. Otherwise, we will thank all the presenters today for all of the inspiring research and sharing that so graciously with us all. Thank you so much for everyone for also participating and attending today. Really, really wonderful to spend the last hour with you all. All right, have a great day, and also long weekend, apparently. So have a great long weekend, everyone. Take care. Bye now.